Let me begin. My gratitude is that all of you, Jim and everyone else who put this conference together, because I hope everyone here at least knows how important it is to have these kinds of conversations, because we're talking about the future of our children and our grandchildren, and that's important to all of us. My regrets are that when Jim asked me to come to do this today, I'd already made a commitment in Manhattan, Kansas, where I have to do the opening keynote tomorrow morning for the Kansas Rural Life Center. So I'm going to unfortunately have to leave right after this part of the conference, because I got a 9-hour drive to get there to be there tomorrow morning. So, and I hate to do that. I always hate it when people come and do a presentation and then leave, instead of staying around to have some conversations. But unfortunately, that's the position that I'm in today. But Jim has my email address, and I would like to encourage any of you who have some conversations you want to continue with me after I leave to feel free to send me an email, and I do try to answer my email every day. So the title of the challenge is Provide Supply. And I would imagine that everybody here agrees that provide is about just how do we get farmers to provide the food supply, but how do we all do this together? Because that's why we're here together. And we have to begin to address these kinds of questions together. And I want to start with, and we heard this last night too, that the way in which the public media very often addresses this question of how are we going to provide food is how are we going to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050, right? And I have to say, I want to start, first of all, by, from my perspective at least, that this is the wrong question. And it's the wrong question for a number of reasons, because it implies that the only problem that we have with 9 billion people on the planet is producing enough food for them. And then if we just get somebody to do that, and of course, all of those food used as a moral justification for what they've been doing rather than beginning to. So the first thing we have to recognize, the first reason that it's the wrong question, is that people who have actually looked at this problem from the point of view of simply a production problem have pointed out that today, from a calorie per capita basis, we're now producing enough food to feed 10 billion people. So it's not a problem of production today, and yet, with only 7 billion people on the planet, we have almost 1 billion that are chronically hungry. So the problem today, at least, is not a production problem. It's a lot of other problems that if we're going to solve the problem of hunger, we have to address. It's a problem of poverty. It's a problem of entitlement. People don't have access to the resources and the information that they need to produce enough food even for their own families. It's a problem of inequality. Almost % of the world's population today lives on less than $2 a day. How are you going to feed your family on that? And it's also a problem of waste. As was mentioned yesterday or last night, we're, by most calculations, we're now wasting almost 40% of the food that we produce. And a lot of that's wasted actually on the farm. And it's not because farmers are wasteful, it's because the market won't buy fresh fruits and vegetables if they have a tiny blemish on it. And so when you walk through a horticulture farm in California during harvest time, you're going to see all of these fresh fruits and vegetables laying on the ground that farmers have just thrown away because nobody's going to buy them because they have a little blemish. And some of these problems, and then of course, in addition to that, a lot of the waste comes where people eat food, whether it's at a college cafeteria or wherever it is. And we tend to get our food, off of a place where everything is out there for us, and we pile it on our plate, and then we don't eat it all, and it goes back into the wastebasket. So a lot of these problems are actually some weeks ago. France decided that it didn't make sense for farmers to throw away this delicious, nutritious food, whole food in their fields because it had a tiny blemish on it. So what they decided to do was to create a special section in their supermarket where they sold this slightly blemished food at 30% discount. And you know what the big problem now is? Adequate supply. So, you know, we got to begin using our big brains here in terms of addressing a problem and recognize, first of all, and this is why this conference is so important, that we're all in this together. These are not problems that farmers are going to be able to solve by themselves, or that input companies are going to be able to solve by themselves, or that food companies are going to solve by themselves. We all have to become engaged in this, and there is an issue of ethics and values that's connected with these problems. A second problem that we have with all of this is that when we say, how are we going to feed 9 billion people by the year 2050, it's sort of like the number of people is not a problem. And I know this is an uncomfortable issue for a lot of people. For some people, it's an uncomfortable issue for theological reasons. For some, it's an uncomfortable position for policy reasons. But as soon as you start to talk about whether or not the kind of population growth that we have in the human community and have had, especially over the last century, is simply not sustainable into the future. Because if we continue to grow at the rate of 1% population a year, you know, on indefinitely into the future, at some point we're going to have some planet that's not even going to be enough room for us to stand on it. So at some point we have to deal with this. And I've always felt that, although Leopold made a very interesting observation in one of his essays, where he talked about the problem of species density. And he said, based on his observation for over 20 years in terms of how nature operates, it became very clear to him that nature always abhors the density of any species. And as soon as any species gets out of balance with the collection of the whole, which has to be healthy together, and that means you have to have the kind of balanced diversity in order for it to be self-renewing and self-regulating, then nature finds a way to reduce that density. And as he said, if one system fails, she will find another. So if we want to have, in other words, a healthy, total biotic community of which, as Leopold said, we are simply plain members and citizens, then we have to begin to look at so that biotic community must be healthy. And if people have addressed that, probably the human species shouldn't be more than 3 billion people. Some have said 5 billion people. I don't know anybody that said, yeah, 9 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion is going to be okay. If we're really interested in the health of the whole creation, which is really what we're talking about here. Now, we have some very important information, some of this was pointed to last night, within our religious traditions, at least within our Judeo-Christian community, and also with other religious communities as well, who've all addressed this issue. But within the Judeo-Christian community, the book of Genesis provides us with some very interesting information. When it talks about the garden that we live in within creation, how are we supposed to relate to that? And you know, part of the core thing here, and this was mentioned last night, and most of our English translations refers to that we need to do this from the point of view of looking at how we till and care for the garden. Well, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'm fortunate in having some scholars who are Hebrew scholars, some colleagues who are Hebrew scholars, and they tell me that the actual translation of that should not be to till and to care for, but it should be to serve and preserve. Our role in the garden is to serve and preserve. Where we keep from the garden, not so to eat the tree of knowledge. The tree of life, of course, is creation as we experience it. It's how nature functions. That's the tree of life. The tree of knowledge is when we think we know better. And if we eat from the tree of knowledge, there are going to be a series of curses that are going to follow. The soil will be cursed, our relationships to each other will be cursed. Well, you've all read the list. And I would argue that we are at a point right now where we are eating primarily from the tree of knowledge, that we know better. And every farmer, every input supplier, every food processor, everybody engaged in the food and agriculture system, in fact, everybody in any kind of part of our economy today operate out of a single principle, and that's maximum efficient production for short-term economic return. If you don't operate by that principle, you're just not relevant. Now, if you're operating by maximum efficient production for short-term economic return, about the garden, So these issues, values issues that I think we have to begin to include in the conversation, regardless what part of the economy one is a part of. And it isn't just an issue for farmers, it's an issue for all of us together. And then as a part of this too, again, you can probably gather by now, although Leopold is one of my heroes because he was an individual who simply had so much insight into so many of these issues. He didn't write a lot about agriculture, but he did at least a couple of essays, and he always implied that agriculture was a part of this. And one of his observations was that one of the things we needed to recognize is that we are not the conquerors of what he called the land community, by which he meant, again, the entire interacting biotic community of which we are all a part. We are not the conquerors of the land community. We're simply plain members and citizens. So we have to recognize that we are a part of creation, which includes all of the biotic life in the community, everything from those microbes in the soil, which incidentally, even soil scientists are just now beginning to understand the extent of those microbes and the way I'm thinking about, but I saw 1 million single teaspoonful of soil. Some have even said probably as many as 4 in a single teaspoonful of soil. So there is far more living organisms in creation beneath the surface of the soil than above the surface of the soil. And in our culture, we still think soil is just dirt, right? These are issues that we all have to come to terms with, because if we don't have biologically healthy soil, which is the foundation of all of life, then we're not going to accomplish any of the other issues, any of the other goals, any of the other attitude, or any of the other interests that we have for the future and for our children and our grandchildren. Okay, so that's the first part. I got 4 other parts here, so we're going to try to go through this pretty quickly. The other thing that I think we need to do now, in addition to understanding these complexities of the system that we're involved in and that we're simply a part of those, we also have to come to terms with the fact that we need to now start anticipating the future. Because we'll come level sustainable, make little adjustments here and there, then everything will be fine and go on forever. And that's simply not true. Because we are now moving into a new era, especially in terms of food and agriculture, but in terms of all of our economy. And Ernest Shusky, who's an anthropologist, published a book back in 1989 called Culture and Agriculture. And he tried to call to our attention that we are now moving into a new era, particularly in food and agriculture. And so he paints a picture for us, as you would expect from an anthropologist. How have we humans fed ourselves ever since we've been on the planet? And he points out that from the beginning, from the time that we appeared on the planet until about 10,000 years ago, we fed ourselves as hunter-gatherers. So we weren't food producers, we were food collectors. We went out into creation, into nature, and harvested whatever we wanted to feed ourselves. And then about 10,000 years ago, we started to do agriculture. We call that the Neolithic period. And now we did start to cultivate, we started to domesticate plants and animals. We did all of the things that we all know we do in agriculture, right? And he says that was a very land-intensive kind of agriculture because we didn't have the kind of inputs that we use now. So primarily it was a slash-and-burn agriculture. So we'd take a part of nature, burn the perennial grasses or trees, use that ash into the soil together with the natural fertility, and it'd be pretty productive for 4 or 5 years. Then we'd abandon slash-and-burn. We fed ourselves for years. And then he argues that at the beginning of the 20th century, we entered into a third era of producing ourselves, which he calls, I always love this term, the neo-caloric era, because it's entirely based on old calories. And he argues that this will of necessity be a very short period of time in the timeline of human history because they're old calories, so they're not renewable. So at some point they're going to be gone, and then we can't produce our food this way anymore. So what are these old calories? Well, they're fossil fuels. And anybody that's paying any attention knows that the era of cheap energy, because it's entirely dependent on fossil fuels, is going to be over. Is that 10 years from now, 20 years from now? T-Bone Pickens, who's an oil guy from Texas, he said 2 years ago that we should expect that crude oil will be $350 a barrel in 10 years. So that's 8 years from now. Now, I think he made that projection before he realized how much oil we were going to fracking. You're still, and that those fossil fuels are no longer going to be there. So what I like to say when I have conversations with farmers, and I try to do this a lot now, let's assume that crude oil will be $350 a barrel 20 years from now. Now, that's not that long into the future. And then there are other old calories. There are the minerals, the rock phosphate and potash, for example. We only have 4 countries that still have rock phosphate reserves, only 4 that still have potash reserves. You have all the other minerals, iron ore, copper that we use for the machinery that we produce and use on the farm. So you've got all these minerals which we're extracting. And Hugo Bardi, who has just produced a new Club of Rome report called Extracted, in which he points out all of the minerals that we're using up. They're all part of those old calories, and at some point they're going to be gone. They're not going to be there. And then you have also the issue of fossil water. Much of the water that we use, 70% of all of the fresh water on our planet we use just for agriculture irrigation. And so even the Ogallala Aquifer from southern South Aquifer by half since 1960, but 2 recent studies would have been done now, which were withdrawing the Ogallala Aquifer now, and because it's a fossil aquifer, it's not renewable. It's not going to, you get some water that goes back into the aquifer, but it's very, very slow, because this is water that's been piling up in the aquifer since the Ice Age. And according to these 2 new studies now, if we continue to draw water out of the Ogallala Aquifer at the rate that we're drawing now, it will be out of water in 20 years. So let's imagine that 20 years from now, crude oil will be $350 a barrel, that fertilizer costs will be at least 5 or 6 times what they are now, and we're increasing the cost of fertilizer now. Every farmer knows that. And that we only have half the amount of fresh water on the planet that we're currently dependent on. And then add the other big elephant in the room, and that's climate change. We're going to have more unstable climate, more droughts, more floods, more severe weather events. And as the most recent International Panel on Climate Change report points out, climate change is no longer an issue of the future. About almost a third of the weather that's going to determine how productive a farmer can be on his own farm. So let's assume all of these things. And then the question which I like to, the food fight is not useful. It doesn't help any of us to say, well, the organic farmers are doing it right and the conventional farmers are doing it wrong, or the other way around. As we anticipate the changes coming at us, we all got to ask the same question. And I like to meet with a group of farmers around a table with beer and ask this question. Suppose that 20 years from now, crude oil will be $350 a barrel, that we have twice the number of severe weather events, that we have half the amount of fresh water, and that fertilizer costs are 5 or 6 times. Can you still do what you're doing today? I have yet to meet a single farmer that says, yeah, we can deal with that. Everybody understands that these are huge challenges that we have to face. Okay, so now here's part of, I want to get to a little bit of good news here before I have to quit. And we know, for example, that we have some wisdom from the past that we can draw on. There have been people from the beginning, after Justus von Liebig came up with his research and his paper, saying, we don't have to worry about the laborious process of renewing our soils because we just use inputs, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, and then, problem solved. Well, there were people from the beginning, like Sir Albert Howard, for example, who wrote 2 books. The first one was called An Agriculture Testament. And he said, this, what he called NPK mentality, is the wrong direction. As a matter of fact, he said, it's a form of banditry because it's going to steal biologically healthy soils from future generations. So we have to go in a different direction. What we really need to do in agriculture is use nature as the model. We should mimic nature in the way in which we do agriculture. And he lays out, already back in 1940, he laid out a strategy for how we do that. So it's all there. The wisdom is there. The wisdom from the past is there. You also had Liberty Hyde Bailey, the first dean of agriculture in the United States at Cornell University. And among the many books that he wrote was one which he published in 1915, so a few months from 100 years ago, entitled The Holy Earth. And he said, we have to change our attitude. We have to have a new attitude in terms of how we relate to nature when we do agriculture. And it's a brilliant piece already 100 years ago available to us as part of the old wisdom. There's also, of course, Aldo Leopold. In one of his essays, he said, It was no doubt inevitable and perhaps even desirable that industrialization would come to farm life, but someday it will die of its own too much. Its own too much. So here we are, 70 years later, still not having paid much attention to this wisdom from the past. And there are many others, Lady Eve Balfour, G.I. Rodale, all people part of this body of wisdom we have from the past. Now, let's suppose that we took this wisdom from the past and we married it with the new science of ecology, evolutionary biology, and resilience thinking. If we took this new science, which we've barely even touched on, in applying it to agriculture, and if we married that wisdom from the past with the science the new science that's available to us, I'm convinced that we could come up with dramatic new kinds of agriculture that would in fact do what Sir Robert Howard was insistent on, and that is to have an agriculture which is essentially self-renewing and self-regulating. Now, the other thing that we have to address here, I'm just going to show you a new ethic, really supplied that for us. He developed this land, if you really think of land, what should that look like? And he has this brilliant short piece, and I'm not going to, most of you are probably aware of it, and if not, I want you to go back and read all the Leopold Center County Almanac, and it's there. But then after he articulates this land ethic, he says, so how are we going to get there? And that was, he recognized as the difficult problem. It's the problem we still have today. How are we going to get there? How do we adopt and apply this new ethic? And he finally concluded that what we have to do is to develop what he called an ecological conscience. In other words, our role as humans isn't just caring about our fellow humans. It's having a conscience of caring for the entire biotic community. And he said that ecological conscience then has to be focused on what he called the health of the land. And land health was, and again, land being not just the fields out there, but land being this entire biotic community. Land health was the land's capacity for self-renewal. They hadn't even heard of it yet. But he wanted to say this was probably going to have to be a product of social evolution. And so my hopeful message to all of us today is we are now reaching that point of social evolution where we have the opportunity to create this kind of ecological conscience, and that's why conferences like this are so important. And in this matter, I also, and there's a couple of other good news things that can happen. Maybe we can do that during the question and answer period. But the other thing that I think is important here, and another one of my heroes is Thomas Berry, and he pointed out at one point that we should always recognize that moments of crises are in fact moments of grace. Because most of us, he said, are not willing to take the initiative to make the kind of changes we do until we start to feel the pain. And then that motivates us to do the things that we need to do. So we should recognize that moments of crisis are moments of grace. Now, I want to assure you that as we anticipate the changes coming at us, we're going to have a lot of moments of crisis. So it's important for all of us to recognize that these are moments of grace, moments of opportunity, to actually engage everyone in our community. And this is an issue we all have to address because we have to reinvent not only our food system, but our entire economy of how we function in the future. An economy that recognizes that we have to serve and preserve the garden in which we live and not just exploit it and use it and feel that we know better with our eating from our tree of knowledge rather than the tree of life. So let me just leave those thoughts with you. I look forward to, I want to also mention too, one other quick thing, and Roger may have mentioned this himself, but maybe Roger is also a little bit of, a not self-promoting individual. But Roger published an article day before yesterday called Family Farmers' Role in World Hunger. And among other things, he points out that family farms provide a model for the world to diminish major health and hunger issues. And I think Roger's exactly right about that. And this isn't just a matter of family farmers in the United States, but it's especially a matter of family farms throughout the world. And 70% of the world's food today is produced by family farms, and most of them are actually women. And so if we want to solve the problem of hunger, we have to work with those farms and not assume that we're simply going to, crops that we on a viable basis go into the world market and own systems in their own communities, in their own countries, providing them with the resources. And there are 5 UN reports now out, the first one being Agriculture at a Crossroads, the last one, Time to Wake Up. And all 5 of those reports essentially say the same thing, and that is if we want to solve the problem of hunger, we have to work with smallholder farmers in their own communities, provide them with the information, the resources they need, enable them to work together, and that's what's going to then enable them and again address this question of inequality and poverty, and then we can begin to actually address the problem of hunger. So thank you.